President Trump expected to arrive back on U.S. soil in the next hour after a jam-packed G20 in Hamburg, including his first face-to-face with Vladimir Putin. Good evening, everyone. I'm Julie Banderas. You're watching the Fox Report. Russia's foreign minister telling reporters President Trump accepted Putin's claims that Moscow did not meddle in the U.S. election. The president's ambassador to the United Nations disputing that, saying the president still knows they meddled. Here's what Putin said to reporters today.
Our position is known. There are no grounds for saying Russia interfered in the U.S. election.
Another big headline from the summit, North Korea. The president reportedly telling the Chinese president something has to be done about the rogue nation. He tweeted, leaving Hamburg for Washington, D.C., and the White House just left China's President Xi Jinping, where we had an excellent meeting on trade and North Korea. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts has more from Hamburg tonight. So, John, there is some discrepancy over exactly what was said about election meddling during the Trump-Putin meeting. It's a bit confusing. Maybe you could clear it up for us.
I think we're still a little bit confused here, too, because White House officials haven't fully cleared this up either. Here's where the discrepancy stems from. During that 2-hour and 15-minute bilateral meeting yesterday between President Trump and President Putin, President Trump pressed Putin on intelligence and allegations that Russia meddled in the U.S. election last year, to which Putin said, no, I didn't do it, and neither did the Russian government. Now, the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, says the president pressed this point several times until they finally agreed to disagree, that they didn't want the entire meeting to become an argument about this, so they moved on to other topics. Following that meeting, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said that the president accepted Vladimir Putin's assurances that he didn't meddle in the election, to which White House officials said, no, that's not the way it happened. So today we heard from Vladimir Putin himself, who said he believes that the president accepted, at least in some way, what he was saying. Listen here.
He asked questions. He was genuinely interested in a number of details. As far as I could, I answered him in detail. He asked me questions. I answered. I clarified. And I think that he was satisfied with my answers.
He said, I think he was satisfied, but he also said, listen, you're going to have to ask the president to really know what his true thoughts are. We haven't had a chance to ask the president that, Julie. We thought that he was going to hold a press conference this afternoon. Apparently, time kind of got away from them. So first opportunity we have back in the United States, or maybe in France next week, to ask the president the question. We will, and we'll hear it from the horse's mouth.
All right. I wonder if there were any reporters in the room, then we would maybe get this story one way or the other. But let's move on. The leaders discussed climate change as well. Was there any disagreement there?
Well, first of all, not likely that they're going to let reporters into a bilateral meeting between the president of the United States.
I know, it just would be nice if we had a journalist in there.
Exactly,
to give us the real story.
You can always wish, Julie. You can always wish. To your point about climate change, of course, we remember that back at the beginning of June, the president announced that the United States was going to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. That was a matter of some disagreement between the United States and the rest of the members of the G20. Prime Minister Theresa May of the UK tried to convince President Trump to stay in the Paris Accord. He declined. She said that she was dismayed by that. And then the U.S. pulling out of the climate accord made it into the final communique, really an exercise in pointing fingers here. The communique says, quote, we take note of the decision of the USA, United States of America, to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. The leaders of the other G20 members state that the Paris Agreement is irreversible. We reaffirm our strong commitment to the Paris Agreement, moving swiftly toward its full implementation. So here is an area on which it looks like the United States and the other 19 member nations of the G20 have agreed to disagree, and those other 19 members are letting the White House know they're not happy with what the president did, Julie.
Okay, there's also some controversy, John, over Ivanka Trump sitting in for the president during one of the G20 meetings, as we talked about. Obviously, journalists are not allowed in there, and certainly certain members of his own cabinet are not, but his daughter was.
Yes, and she was there during a couple of sessions. One of them was a session about African migration and health. And this is something that she had a keen interest in because she had announced just hours before with the president of the World Bank a $50 million contribution from the United States to a facility for women's entrepreneurship in Africa. So this really was right in her wheelhouse. The president had to leave to go to one of his bilateral meetings. So Ivanka Trump, who had been sitting at a table behind her father, moved into his position, and a member of the Russian delegation snapped a picture and put it on Twitter. That picture and the tweet were later deleted, but there you can see Ivanka Trump sitting right between President Xi Jinping of China and Prime Minister Theresa May. Now, people are leaping to her defense after some criticism on Twitter. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, saying in a statement, at least in an interview with CBS's Face the Nation, which will air tomorrow, quote, "She's got her certain issues she focuses on, and when those things come up, then that's where she is, and that's what she likes to focus on." Angela Merkel, who was the host of the G20 summit, didn't seem to see a problem with it. She said in her press conference, quote, "The delegations themselves decide, should the president not be present for a meeting, who will then take over and sit in the chair. That is something other delegations do also. It is very well known that she works at the White House and is also engaged in certain issues." So it seems, Julie, that the only people that had a problem with this were the people who saw that photograph on Twitter and decided to make a comment about it. Donald Trump Jr., her big brother, got into a Twitter war with Ana Navarro, who is a Republican strategist on Twitter. I'll leave it to folks at home to look up those tweets. But it was a matter of some controversy here. But again, the woman who put on this affair here in Hamburg said not a problem with her. Julie?
And she does tend to complain a lot about Trump, so I think she'll find any reason to go on Twitter and fight with somebody.
Well, Ana Navarro, yeah, no question.
Don't I mean, she's very vocal, so I mean, this is perfect for her.
And don't forget, too, this is not the first time that Ivanka Trump has been at an Angela Merkel event. She was here in Germany a few weeks ago as well for a very prominent event. So the two of them do have a relationship.
Yeah, I mean, if Angela Merkel is not complaining about it, perhaps some American political strategists shouldn't be. But anyway, that's all we have to say.
I'll leave it to them to figure that out. Thank you, Julie.
I'll leave it to the world leaders. How about that? All right, John Roberts, thank you very much. So White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus will be weighing in on the G20 summit with Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday. Check your local listings for times. Fox News Alert: police spraying water cannons as new violence breaks out in Germany after the G20 summit. And now we are taking you there live. As you can see, when this G20 summit first commenced, there were some pretty violent protests erupting there. Things seemed to be going more in a peaceful route, but rioters actually have been taking it up a notch once again, throwing items at police who tried to use the cannons, those water cannons, as you can see there, shooting out of those police vehicles into the crowds, trying to disperse them, essentially. This comes after days of riots, though. More than 140 people have been arrested and some 200 officers injured. Senior Foreign Affairs correspondent Greg Palcott has the latest from Germany.
Julie, the G20 summit here in Hamburg, Germany is over. Doesn't look like the violence is over yet, though. We have new reports of clashes between protesters and police in yet another neighborhood of this city. There were skirmishes late this afternoon as well. Take a look at what we saw.
This is a sign of just how tense things are here. A peaceful protest in Hamburg has turned dangerous and violent. We're looking at police confronting the protesters. There are bottles being thrown, there are water cannons being shot, and the people here are very angry. It has been violent. People have been taken away. We're hearing the police, we're hearing the protesters. It's going to get uglier now.
Again, those clashes happened at the end of a largely peaceful march. 50,000 were out on the street. Still, they had some angry words to say about G20 politics, about capitalism, and yes, about President Trump. Overnight, though, saw the worst violence that we have seen. 1,500 anarchists ransacking a neighborhood here in Hamburg. Fires were set, stores looted, Molotov cocktails thrown. Riot police stormed building. 213 police and dozens of protesters were injured. 114 people were arrested. Despite 20,000 police out on the street, the city was reduced, according to one account, to mob rule. Now, President Trump, along with German Chancellor Angela Merkel, praised the security forces here in what might have been an impossible task, securing this second biggest German city for a global summit being held right in the middle. Julie.
Okay, so as the summit there wraps up, the protests continue, this going for days now. Hamburg, Germany there, where you can see police vehicles spraying, and they have paused at the moment, but just moments ago we saw them live spraying water cannons into the crowd. Essentially, that is meant to break up crowds in order to prevent any violence from breaking out, because at this point there have been moments of violence. Over 200 officials, law enforcement officials, have been injured. A lot of angry protesters out there getting out of control, but for now it seems things are remaining peaceful and quiet this evening. But we will continue to monitor this and bring you live pictures as news warrants. Right now, we are learning the Pentagon sent 2 bombers to the Korean Peninsula as a show of force to the north. The U.S. aircraft joined South Korean and Japanese fighter jets on a test bombing run. The Pentagon confirming the exercise was in response to the regime's recent missile launch. We'll have much more on this coming up at the bottom of the hour. And still ahead right here on the Fox Report, federal courts are refusing to clarify President Trump's travel ban, as Hawaii continues to lead the charge against that controversial order. Coming up, how one federal judge is passing the buck all the way to the Supreme Court. Plus, Republican senators setting to return to Washington on Monday. They're ready to debate possible changes to their health care bill and make the case that will drive costs down.
We have the responsibility to actually, I think, dismantle it, to repeal it, and then actually introduce something that will help drive down the premiums.
A federal appeals court refusing to weigh in on President Trump's travel ban of 6 predominantly Muslim nations after Hawaii state lawyers have challenged the executive order for a second straight day. Just hours earlier, federal judge Derek Watson denied a similar motion from Hawaii, ruling the Supreme Court should clarify who can and cannot enter the country. Now, you may remember the confusion surrounding the president's initial travel ban. It sparked massive protests at airports from coast to coast. It's back to business in Washington as lawmakers will be returning from their July 4th recess on Monday. Republicans, they will be busy because they are gearing up for a final push to repeal and replace Obamacare. Now drawing up some possible last-minute changes. Changes former Congressman Jason Chaffetz says will create competition in the marketplace. Listen.
If you get rid of the individual mandate, if you get rid of some of those onerous taxes and allow insurance companies to sell across state lines, then you're actually going to have competition. I think it's frustrating to Americans when you have legislation that they don't actually vote on it. If it gets voted down, it gets voted down. We go back to the drawing board. But if the Senate will pass something, I think the House will be very, very open to actually endorsing that and voting for it.
Now, Democrats aren't as optimistic as you can imagine. They say those proposals will only drive premiums up. Ellison Barber explains.
Hi, Julie. The Republican road to health care reform has been covered in potholes, and it's far from a smooth ride today. According to analysis from the Roper Center, this is the most unpopular major piece of legislation in the past 30 years. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says it's complicated.
We're in a big discussion among ourselves, that is the Senate Republican Conference, about the way forward, and I don't have the answer to that yet. I think every Republican is in favor of association health plans. The problem is whether it can be included from a parliamentary point of view in what we're trying to do. It's a very complicated procedure.
Senate Republicans initially said they expected to pass health care legislation by July 4th. Instead, they received opposition to the plan from Democrats and members of their own party. At one point, President Trump said if Senate Republicans can't pass something, they should repeal now and replace later. But there is a new proposal from Senator Ted Cruz that would allow insurers to sell stripped-down, cheaper plans.
I'm very, very active in helping lead the effort for Republicans to honor our promise to repeal Obamacare and for us to pass patient-centered reforms.
Senator Mike Lee is supporting the plan, and the White House seems open to it as well.
We support Senator Cruz and Senator Lee's efforts. This is similar to efforts that transpired in the House, and we think that it's perfectly appropriate, his amendment. And so we hope it's part of the process of bringing everybody together.
Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer, however, calls Cruz's amendment a hoax, saying, quote, it makes health care more expensive because deductibles and co-payments would be so onerous that many Americans would pay much more out of their pockets than they pay today. It could be a difficult sell to moderate Republicans as well. In an interview posted online, Senator Chuck Grassley told Iowa Public Radio he's concerned the proposal is subterfuge and could annihilate the pre-existing condition requirement in the existing bill. Julie?
Ellison Barber, thank you. And health care is on the minds of many Americans. The topic is dominating town halls held by lawmakers, including this one with Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren. And this one co-hosted by Republican Senator Ted Cruz. It was actually meant to talk about veteran issues, but angry constituents gave the senator an earful at multiple events this week.
Let me give you a real-world example. Sir, I'm happy to answer your questions, but I'm not going to engage in a yelling back and forth. If you want an answer to my question, I'll answer.
Republican Texas Senator Ted Cruz shining a light on the issues affecting veterans in our country. The senator teaming up with Concerned Veterans for America to host a town hall today in Houston. The event focusing on reforming the Veteran Affairs Department. Cruz saying that those who serve should have a choice whether they receive health care. Listen.
If you want to go to the VA, if you think the VA is where you're going to get the best service, that is your right. You have bled for it, you have earned it, and we need to protect that right. But if, on the other hand, you want to see the local doctor down the street, the local cardiologist, you ought to be able to have that right too. You ought to be able to have the option to say, where do I think I can get the best care?
Casey Stiegel has more from Houston.
Julie, long wait times at the VA and patients falling through the cracks of the system are among some of the main concerns that we heard today at this town hall meeting that was hosted by Texas Senator Ted Cruz and a group called Concerned Veterans for America. This was the final stop in Texas. Cruz held similar events this past week in the Dallas area, over in Austin, and down in McAllen near the border. These have been open to veterans and their family members to sound off about real-life experiences they've had and how to better improve the system. Today, the senator speaking a lot about accountability within the current system and introducing more competition to the marketplace, which would give veterans more options to address all of their needs.
But if, on the other hand, you want to see the local doctor down the street, the local cardiologist, you ought to be able to have that right too. You ought to be able to have the option to say, where do I think I can get the best care?
Each of these events have brought out protesters. About 50 or so showed up here in Houston today. They were here to primarily have their voices heard about the repeal of Obamacare. Not so much veterans issues, but they saw this as an opportunity to reach their senator while he was in their home state and urge him to, quote, do the right thing.
I think it's okay to critique current laws and to try to fix current laws, but it's scary if they try to pass any of the legislation that's currently being considered, because people will die. They will lose their insurance coverage. They will go bankrupt.
Senator Cruz says one of the most common grievances he has heard from people as he has been out and about in the field meeting with constituents is that health care insurance premiums are too expensive and so many people cannot afford them altogether. That's why he says he is pressing Senate Republicans to get the cost down for everyone. Julie?
Casey Stiegel, thank you. Democratic Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren also fielding questions from her constituents. Warren speaking to a crowd at Berkshire Community College, and health care was a main focus as well. Listen.
No one who's undergoing treatment should worry about whether or not she's going to bankrupt her family. No one should worry about whether or not she's going to have to make a choice between prescription drugs and putting food on the table. No one should have to lose a job because otherwise they're not going to be able to pay for their health care. This is not who we are, and this is not the way we want to deliver health care in America.
Warren then urged the crowd to reach out to residents of Republican states to pressure lawmakers to oppose the Senate health care bill. We are getting more details on how the U.S. and its allies conducted a test bombing run over the Korean peninsula. Who else took part in the exercise, and what other options the Pentagon may be considering? Plus, the Trump administration inspiring bipartisan agreement on its voter fraud commission, but it may not be the kind the White House was hoping for.
I certainly appreciate the bipartisan participation in this conference, in this press conference, because as secretaries, we know that if we have bipartisan support, if we stand together, that's how we get things done.
I'm Julie Banderas, and this is the Fox Report. It's the bottom of the hour. Time now for the top of the news. President Trump is on his way home from the G20 summit in Hamburg, Germany. Air Force One expected to land at Joint Air Force Air Base Andrews in the next hour. This as Vladimir Putin makes claims about his first face-to-face meeting with President Trump. The Russian leader saying he denied interfering in the 2016 election, and he thinks President Trump believed him. While Putin also had this to say.
As for personal relations, I think we have established them with Trump. I don't know how this sounds, but the way I see Trump on TV is very different from the real person. He's absolutely straightforward. He perceives the interlocutor in an adequate manner, analyzes and answers the questions quite quickly.
And President Trump talking about the threats from North Korea with the leaders of Japan and China as well. The president had recently called on Beijing to do more to rein in the rogue regime, but called today's meeting, quote, excellent. U.S. officials describing it as a show of force. 2 American bombers flying by the Korean DMZ in response to the North launching its first intercontinental ballistic missile. Garrett Tenney has more from Washington. Garrett.
Really, it's important for folks to remember that every time North Korea conducts a missile launch, that it's another step towards their goal of a nuclear missile that can hit the United States. This morning, the U.S. and its allies wanted to send a message that we are ready to fight back. 2 U.S. B-1 bombers flew 2,000 miles from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam to just outside of the Korean demilitarized zone. Japanese and South Korean fighter jets escorted the bombers, which conducted a precision strike training exercise in what is a simulated attack on North Korea. The bombers, which can each carry 85 of the 500-pound bombs, practiced making attack runs by dropping inactive weapons on targets at a testing range in South Korea. Following the mission, the commander of U.S. Air Forces in the Pacific released a statement saying North Korea's actions are a threat to our allies, partners, and homeland. Let me be clear. If called upon, we are trained, equipped, and ready to unleash the full lethal capability of our allied air forces. And while the U.S. is prepared to take military action, Secretary of Defense James Mattis also made it clear yesterday that diplomatic efforts are still the focus for both U.S. and world leaders.
This is a diplomatically led international effort to stop a worldwide threat that they are bringing to bear. So it is led by diplomacy right now. There are United Nations efforts underway, as you're aware, certainly our Secretary of State. And we also see economic aspects to the diplomatic effort to divert them from this wrong path.
And those diplomatic efforts continued today as President Trump met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Julie?
And so we've also heard that North Korea was one of the leading topics in that meeting. Do we know if any progress was made?
Well, administration officials, they haven't shared many details of what those discussions were like, but they've characterized the conversations as direct and very substantive. President Trump, though, didn't waste any time bringing up North Korea, and he had this to say right before the meeting began.
I appreciate the things that you have done relative to the very substantial problem that we all face in North Korea, a problem that something has to be done about. As far as North Korea is concerned, I know that we'll have eventually success. It may take longer than I'd like, may take longer than you'd like, but there will be success in the end, one way or the other.
China is the focal point of the U.S.'s diplomatic effort. Beijing accounts for about 90% of North Korea's trade, and U.S. officials have openly criticized the Chinese this week for not using that overwhelming influence to deter Kim Jong-un's nuclear ambitions, and we'll have to see if that changes after today's meeting. Julie?
All right, Garrett Tenney in Washington, thank you.
You got it.
Well, back here at home, state officials from across the country are meeting in Indianapolis to tackle election security head on. This as President Trump tries to gather the personal information of every American voter, a request several states are refusing.
Count me as someone who is concerned about why this information is being put together in a central place. I do think that this is an odd time to be forming a national database of some kind when we're so concerned about security.
Brian Yanis joins me now here in the studio with the very latest. So, Brian, how else are secretaries of state reacting to this voter fraud investigation?
Well, really, look, this is part of a summer conference that's held by the National Association of Secretaries of States. 37 are participating. Remember, secretaries of states, they oversee their own elections. And this year, the election security is on everyone's mind, from Russian attempts to interfere last fall and voter fraud. The latter is especially pertinent because the White House created a federal commission on voter integrity, which is demanding that the secretaries of state turn over the following information as part of their investigation into voter fraud: dates of birth, partial Social Security numbers, addresses, voting histories, military service, and other information. Now, the White House says the information will be used to look for potential voter irregularities and advise states on how to improve their practices. But according to a count by the Associated Press, 16 states and the District of Columbia have outright denied the White House's request, some citing privacy laws. 30 states say they'll give some data, but not all. 4 states are undecided. Maine Secretary of State vows to protect voter information and denies there was national widespread voter fraud last fall.
I would say personally that I would be stunned to see a number anywhere near that close. But I think I've also said right along the line that, sunshine is the best disinfectant. We take a look at it. We don't find anything that answers the question.
Now, others like Indiana's Secretary of State are providing some voter data.
Everyone's goal here would be to increase the confidence of the American people in the security and integrity of our elections.
Now, missing from this weekend's meeting is Secretary of State of Kansas, Chris Kobach. He's one of the men leading the Voter Fraud Commission, requesting all that information, Julie.
All right, Brian Yanis, thank you very much. Also, okay, we are going to stick around.
I know you wanted to rush me off, but
no, that wasn't me. It was the producers. I would never rush you off. All right, so then you talk to me about, President Trump's reaction to this, because there was a lot of voter fraud and illegal votes being done. People were voting in 2 different states, for goodness sake. There's got to be a tracking system to prevent that from happening.
There has, I guess, but there's never been proof of widespread voter fraud, and certainly not to the number that President Trump has been saying. He has always been repeating that 3 to 5 million undocumented immigrants voted illegally in this election. And on just last week, he tweeted, quote, "Numerous states are refusing to give information to the very distinguished voter fraud panel. What are they trying to hide?" And again, I have to reiterate, there has been no proof, and that is why the White House Commission was set up to find the proof over a claim in which the president has been making now since he's been taking office and since he's taken office.
All right. Never a dull moment. I feel like we're still in an election sometimes. All right, Brian Yanis, thank you.
Good to see you.
Violent clashes erupting a KKK rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, as hundreds of Black Lives Matter and anti-fascist demonstrators crashed the planned event. Police in riot gear arresting several people. The violence comes after a Confederate statue of Robert E. Lee was vandalized. Well, some relief for a town threatened by wildfires, as residents are now returning to their homes after a very close encounter with wildfires.
I was driving home. It was just a little orange glow at the base, and I said, oh boy.
Firefighters are still battling a wildfire in Colorado near the iconic ski town of Breckenridge. Evacuation orders have been lifted for now, but officials say firefighters are still facing danger, and that is slowing the progress of putting out the fire. Will Carr is live from our West Coast newsroom. He's been watching this for us. So, Will, how many fires are burning right now?
Well, good evening, Julie. There are almost 40 wildfires burning in every western state this weekend. Take a look at the map, and you can see fires spread out across 11 states. We We just got an update on the Alamo fire, which is burning about an hour north of Santa Barbara. It's tripled in size and has now charged 19,000 acres and is only 10% contained. Several hundred residents have had to pack up and are under a mandatory evacuation tonight. And take a look at these pictures. An ominous skyline with a blood-red full moon rising over thick flames. More than 1,000 firefighters are battling on both the ground and from the air. Now, unfortunately, they're encountering strong winds and hot temperatures. There is good news, though, in Colorado. Evacuations have been lifted for a fire burning 2 miles north of the popular ski area in Breckenridge. Firefighters on the ground have run into favorable conditions that have allowed them to increase containment to 25%. Take a listen to one resident.
It's just crazy. You know, my friends back home have been calling me like, hey, is everything okay? My mom called me, worried about me. She said, you know, don't go hiking, stay out of the woods. It's okay, Mom.
In Montana, a fire near Landusky's burned nearly 40 square miles and is now 40% contained. Julie, always good when you see those containment numbers ticking up.
Will Carr, thank you very much. The Category 4 hurricane that destroyed Galveston, Texas back in 1900 still holds as the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. Happening now, anchor John Scott tells us how survivors rebuilt their city.
The idyllic beaches of Galveston, Texas. More than 6 million vacationers come here each year, frolicking on the serene shores of the Gulf of Mexico. It's hard to believe, seeing it today, that this peaceful place was the epicenter of the greatest natural disaster in the history of the United States.